The following is a production of Professor Robert Barnwell. Each episode includes insights provided by the chairman, CEOs, and CFOs of the world's most successful corporations, as well as thought leaders from premier business schools and international consultancies. If you and your team would like more information on corporate leadership and strategic management, or would like to learn more about Professor Barnwell, his research, and how he may be able to assist your company, please visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com.
Hello and welcome to CFO Talk Radio. I'm your host, Robert Barnwell. During the last episode, we spoke with RSM McGladry's Bill Spiesman about international mergers and acquisitions and the due diligence process. This is episode 5, and we'll be joined by Wharton School of Business professor Larry Hrebiniak. Dr. Hrebiniak is the author of Making Strategy Work and directs Wharton's popular executive education program, Implementing Strategy, Leading Effective Execution. During this episode, Larry is going to share some depressing statistics and drivers of strategy failure and help identify the increasingly important role of the CFO in strategy development and execution. All right, Larry, well, welcome to CEO Talk Radio. You and Gartner Group have really come up with what I regard as the seminal study on putting strategy to work. Can you discuss the background of the study and what you discovered in terms of the leading causes of strategy failure?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Just by way of background, early on, many years ago when I was doing consulting in areas like competitive strategy, just research on strategy formulation, I began to see a trend, a kind of something I noticed over time that in fact even good strategies weren't working occasionally, and I began questioning why. And it came to me, of course, after a number of these consulting forays that in fact implementation or execution wasn't being done well, that implementation or execution was really a large key to success, that early work with companies like AT&T, GE, just working, for example, on workout and so on, I saw what good companies can do, and they always seem to focus on execution. Around the same time, I and a fellow named Bill Joyce put together an early book, believe it or not, on implementing strategy. It was a conceptual thing. It was a statement, theoretical, logical, but at the time, frankly, no one was interested yet in implementation. Michael Porter was big in competitive strategy, and people were thinking planning and industry analysis and so on, and the book really didn't take off. Well, I didn't give up. I just kept on plugging away, thinking about implementation. Finally, I talked to a few people at Gartner, and they were helpful. I mean, we just worked together. We put together a questionnaire. We identified a sample of managers globally that were dealing with execution or implementation, and we went out and asked a number of different questions. The questionnaire, of course, is referenced in the book, but we got some pretty good responses from 243 people who dealt with execution, and that, of course, started the whole thing. It got me going, and that's what led to the book and led to the book Making Strategy Work. Now, what did we find? You asked why execution fails, what we found. I can't go over everything, but let me mention some of the critical things that struck me right away when we looked at the data. Number one, it was clear that managers were saying that, in effect, a poor or a vague strategy to start with, to begin with, creates execution dilemmas. I mean, if you don't have a good competitive strategy in place, if you haven't thought about it, if you haven't done your analysis, if you haven't done your homework, in fact, execution is going to suffer. I mean, this is rule number one. Good strategy comes first, we found. Number two, sort of surprising, a bit surprising. I knew it would be up there, but managers talked about the inability to manage change and overcome resistance to change as a critical issue in implementation. Again, I thought change would be important because implementation often involves a change in something, whether it's structure, incentives, people. And in fact, these managers were telling us that follow-through, managing change, including cultural change, is important to implementation. If we don't do it well, we're not going to get results. Another issue related to implementation was managers were telling us that in this day and age, with complexity, different business units, different geographical areas, global competition, and so on, that poor information sharing And poor coordination between or among individuals or business units is another cause of poor execution. Companies cannot take the time to rediscover the wheel, that in fact learning should occur. What's discovered in different parts of the world should have an impact in other parts of the world in terms of management and how we do business. Related to that, they were saying that we have to be very clear when it comes to responsibility and accountability. This seems basic, but one of the things they jumped on was that down through the organization, people assume that someone's responsible or accountable for some aspects of implementation, when often that isn't the case. That in fact many things fall into the cracks. That in fact responsibility, accountability, things like that aren't clear. Poor incentives came up a lot. We can spend all day thinking about strategy and making changes and setting short-term objectives, looking at structure, the whole thing, but if we don't provide the right incentives to get people moving in the right direction, in fact, implementation doesn't occur. That incentives are critical. We have to reward the right things. This seems basic, and yet you've heard the expression, sometimes companies will hope for one thing and reward another, that in fact people don't see the urgency or the incentive behind getting something done. One other one I'll mention, because it deals with CEOs, CFOs, and so on. I have a quote in a book, and it basically says a VP, I won't mention the company, said when it comes to execution, his company, quote, lets the grunts handle execution. The grunts. What he was saying was top management does important stuff, and when it comes to execution, they turn it over to lower levels. This turns out to be, of course, in our data and all the analysis we did, totally wrong. That implementation or execution is something that demands support throughout the organization, beginning with the C-level, the CEO, the CFO, and these kinds of things are just important, that people buy into this plan, that it starts at the top. Those are some of the findings. There are some other ones, but I think I've touched on what were the critical points of data we derived from the Gartner study.
It's interesting that you mention incentives and a sense of urgency, because I think that a lot of senior executives lose track of the fact that what's urgent for them may not necessarily, be urgent for those a few levels below them, unless they start changing, the incentives, the accountability, and the expectations.
There's no question about it. I think that's one of the key roles of top management. It's you can't live with a do as I say, not as I do. That I mentioned, for example, Randy Tobias in the book, because when he was with AT&T, he was one of the first people I saw who pursued this strong notion that you have to do, leadership has to set the way. Leadership has to keep abreast of what's going on. Leadership has to let people know that execution's important, that incentives are important, that in fact we're all in the same boat. I know it sounds trite, but he was good at that. I mean, Jack Welch at GE was good at that. An institution of workouts and institution of so many things that got people at different levels involved in the solving of problems, in the execution of strategy. You're absolutely right. Leadership is vital to this. It can't just be leaders sitting back at the home office and enjoying their massive bonuses and hoping that the rest of the organization works well. There's one other point about incentives. I was just reading a paper of a new student coming through, and it struck a note, a PhD student. And his research showed something interesting, that in fact how incentive plans can be gamed by people, that unless CEOs are on top of things, they set incentive plans, and then people learn how to play the game. They start doing things that are consistent with the incentive plan, but maybe not consistent with strategy. It's like, let's get the most we can out of this, that in fact CEOs and others at the top have to stay on top of the incentive plan and constantly ask, are we asking people to do the right things? Are they gaming the system? Are we gaining where we want to gain? Are we achieving the objectives we want to achieve? And to me, that's a very important part of sound leadership in this whole process.
Oh, that's terrific. And so let's continue to pull on that thread. I mean, in order to address the various failures and shortcomings that you've identified, your book comes up with 6 broad steps in addition to, pardon me, what we've talked about in terms of incentives. Could you go through the broad steps of strategy development and implementation?
Yeah, sure. I certainly can. It might take a couple minutes, and I just want to stress that these steps are interdependent. You have to think of them in terms of a whole, a gestalt. This is what implementation looks like. But let's go through it. What are the steps? I've mentioned one already. Strategy formulation comes first. That it all begins with strategy, as I said before. I'll just mention one thing here. If you look at strategy at the corporate level and at the business level, that the integration of the two is often very important for strategy implementation. What do I mean? Corporate strategy, of course, is concerned with the portfolio of the organization, the business portfolio. What businesses are we in, and so on and so forth. They're also concerned at the corporate level with the role of the businesses. So you have a portfolio. Each business plays a role. Is one a cash cow? Is one a star growing? And that seems obvious, but that interaction where corporate looks at the portfolio and does things like hands out resources, sets goals with businesses, tries to evaluate the value added of business performance to the portfolio. These things are critical. If, in fact, business strategy disagrees with or doesn't support corporate strategy, you can see you're going to have poor execution at the corporate level and often at the business level. So I'll start there, that corporate and business people have to be on the same page. Now let's turn to business strategy. I said business strategy comes first. Let's assume that corporate and business have gotten together and set the right goals and having the businesses in the portfolio doing the right things. We now can focus on business strategy, and of course, we all know what's involved here. Sound industry analysis, sound competitor analysis, worrying about competitive advantage, looking at industry forces, the Michael Porter stuff. If you look at industry forces, for example, certain industry forces actually can aid or affect execution. For example, companies that have size, so market power, power over suppliers, power over customers, they can implement strategies a lot easier than companies that don't have this type of power. So we should understand where we fit in an industry. We have to understand what our competitors are doing, understand what our little niche is, if we have one, understand how we get competitive advantage, because if we carve out a kind of differentiated position, in fact, if we do that with business strategy, execution will be a lot easier. One other thing about strategy, and I mentioned this in the book, strategy makes demands on an organization. For example, just take generic strategies, low cost, differentiation. I found in my work that, people who pursue low cost look different. They develop different capabilities than companies that focus on differentiation. Low-cost strategies demand things like, up-to-date technologies, cost controls, robotics, and so on and so forth. It demands structures that, in fact, focus on efficiency. It demands incentives consistent with cost reduction. A whole host of things fit when we talk about low cost. Differentiation might be different. It's getting close to customers. It's different structures. It might be more decentralized organizations getting close to markets, serving customers. It focuses more on marketing. It might focus on R&D with emphasis on D, so to speak, developmental things for customers. In essence, that strategy, low cost, differentiation, really implies or tells us some of the things we have to develop in order to make the strategy work. Okay, let's go further. Once we have strategy set, the book talks about other things. For example, let's take it to the next step at business strategy, aligning short-term and long-term objectives. Ways of doing this, I've mentioned in the book, for example, management by objectives, balanced scorecard, communication plans. Somehow these strategic objectives shouldn't be left alone in a vacuum. They should affect objectives down through the organization. This is a very important part of implementation, that as you go down 2, 3, 4 levels, people at least should understand what they're doing and how that's related somehow to an important execution plan or implementation plan. I've got examples where companies have instituted programs for improvement. They've gone down to lower levels and asked, how is this program working? And the response is, what program? It seems obvious that that connection has to be made, and those objectives have to cascade down through the organization with some plan. Organizational structure is part of this implementation thrust to solve problems. If we have the wrong structure, in fact, we can create problems. If we're going global, the question is, what kind of global strategy? How should we organize? Should we have a worldwide matrix? Should we organize by country, by product, by customer? Some of these things affect, of course, the success of the strategy. Go back to, for example, low cost, an organizational structure that focuses on functional development, process specialization, that achieves efficiency, economies of scale, economies of scope. Those kinds of things are important in terms of structure. We've already touched on interdependence and coordination. Strategy and structure combined affect interdependence. Who has to work with whom? How do they work together? How do they share knowledge? How do we coordinate or integrate across structural units to achieve strategy? So the integration or coordination question, of course, is absolutely vital. Information processing, information sharing. If we discover something great about dealing with clients in the Far East, how does that affect our work in the U.S. or South America? These are issues of knowledge sharing that I think are important. We've also mentioned, as part of the implementation plan, to clarify responsibility and accountability, a responsibility matrix, RACI charts, whatever you want to call them, getting people at different levels to understand whose role is vital and to do what things in the implementation process. And of course, we've already mentioned incentives as part of this whole interdependent plan. We can't do incentives, of course, until we've done some of the other things we've talked about. What are the objectives, long-term, short-term, who has to work with whom? Then incentives come into play to, in fact, support these kinds of things in order to make strategy work. And so basically, those are the early parts. Now, what comes next? We've done formulation, we've done a plan. Now we have to initiate some control processes. Control becomes important. We have to measure performance. Here are these objectives that we said we were going to achieve. Are we achieving them? It's a measurement issue. Having good objectives is part of this. Having good information is part of this. Timely information and valid information. But also, in terms of performance, getting information to the right people. How often have I heard managers say something like, well, I'm not responsible for this, but I'm sure someone in the organization is. Well, often I find someone falls into the cracks. We don't know who someone is. We don't get the information to the right people to make decisions. An important part of control, of course, is analyzing deviations from performance, plus or minus. If I'm performing poorly, as I mentioned in the book, I want to conduct autopsies to find out why I'm performing poorly. But if I'm performing well, I also want to do some sort of analysis. In other words, if I'm shooting for 10% and make 2%, I want to know why. But if I'm shooting for 2% and make 10%, I also want to know why. I want to find out cause and effect. What are we doing that's affecting this outcome? That brings us to a related step, of course, is if we do cause and effect analysis. If we analyze what's going on, it helps organizational learning. And this is how good companies survive over time and adapt over time. They learn. They learn from mistakes. I remember once someone at J&J saying to me, when it comes to learning, it's very important to understand that mistakes are part of innovation. He said to me, if we're not making some mistakes and analyzing them, I know we're not trying to innovate. And that stuck with me over the years, that in fact we've got to, if we want to take risks, we might make mistakes, but we got to learn from them. We have to understand what we did well and understand what we didn't do well. And if we understand that, we can go to the next step, that is focus on change and adaptation. Learn from the good stuff, learn from the bad stuff, and make changes. And of course, that brings us to the question of managing change and how we get people aboard, managing cultural change, which I cover fairly extensively in the book. I might mention some more about that in another context, but basically it's getting people on board, providing the incentives, managing cultural change, so that we could, in step number 6, continue the process, follow up, and start the whole thing over again, make sure that we're all on board and everything is going well.
All right, so in order to address these failures and shortcomings, we've just gone through these 6 steps of strategy development and implementation. What role do you think that the CFO can or should play in this process?
Well, I think as part of the top management group, the C-level group, the CFO can play a very important role. I mean, part of, for example, strategy at the corporate level, we've already said, is portfolio analysis. What businesses are we in? How are we growing? How do we put resources and talent in different businesses? How do we develop capabilities in different businesses to execute strategy well? We don't want the lack of resources, the lack of capabilities, the lack of financial help, in fact, to be the pillar of sound implementation efforts. So you can see that the CFO is part of this C-level team that has to help the CEO very strongly with implementation efforts. Nothing is more frustrating, I've found, to business-level people who are asked to create a business plan and develop an implementation plan, and then find out that, in fact, they're not getting the money, they're not getting the talent, they're not getting the capabilities in order to pull this off. So I think the CFO's role has to be vital. It has to be working not only with the CEO, but with the business heads, dealing with the portfolio, dealing with resources, dealing with the allocation of scarce talent, scarce resources across the portfolio. And of course, the CFO can play an important part too on the control side. That if there are financial people, say within businesses, whether they report solid or dotted line to the CFO's office while they're out in the businesses or out in geographical areas, that whether it's solid or dotted, the question becomes, what role does the CFO's office play in controlling performance, feedback on performance? Not only feedback on performance in terms of products and services, but obviously financial performance. Do we have the right finances, the right talent, the right capabilities to pull this off? So to me, the CFO is part of that top management team. In one of the problems we mentioned that some people thought that they should let the grunts handle execution, lower level people. We said that's simply a poor idea. That in fact, execution is something that occurs across all levels, and it starts at the top. Leadership at the top is vital. Leadership has to set the incentives. Leadership has to focus on setting the right culture, setting the right message, sending the right message down through the organization, and his CFO is part of that.
All right. Well, you certainly outlined a critical role for the CFO, and I know that it's been a trend recently for many larger corporations to establish a permanent position as Chief Strategy Officer. I mean, do you have any opinions about the role of the CSO, Chief Strategy Officer, and maybe? My feeling is the CFO many times is ideally suited for a type of dual hat role.
No, this is true. A couple of comments here. Number one, I'm beginning to see something like a Chief Strategy Officer popping up occasionally too. It can work if you have someone who is concerned about strategic issues, concerned about integrating corporate and business strategy, concerned about asking business heads about their implementation plans. That can be a useful thing. There's only one negative side you have to watch out for. Much like any other corporate or corporate service group or centralized function, that we have to worry and make sure that the centralized function is seen as legitimate by the businesses, that it's close to the businesses and their problems, that it understands their strategies and what's needed for implementation. We've seen in the past that we develop corporate services in different areas like even R&D or strategy or human resources, that sometimes they allow themselves to put a bit of a wall around what they're doing at the corporate level. They're more interested in conceptual things and not close to the businesses. And so that's the only warning or caveat I'd put on it. Having someone who is worried about strategy and integration of plans throughout the business is very useful. Now, secondly, can the CFO play this role? Yeah, I think so. I think the CFO can wear multiple hats. There's a danger here, though, that keep in mind the CFO's first hat, if you will, it deals with finance and so on, and that you need someone, and then in that position, the CFO's position, who has a broad enough picture of the organization, a broad enough picture of how the organization, how the corporate level formulates plans, how the businesses compete, what the global picture looks like. They have to be strategists as well as strong financial types. So if you can get that combination in a strong CFO who also understands strategy, integration, coordination, the role of capabilities, investments, You put all that together, you can have a fairly strong person in that role.
Oh, that's terrific. Well, Larry's book is Making Strategy Work, Leading Effective Execution and Change. It's available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Borders, or any one of the hundreds of bookstores near you. Larry, as always, really enjoyed our talk, and I hope we can count on you to visit with us again. That was Wharton School of Business professor Larry Hrebiniak, author of Making Strategy Work, discussing the alarming rate of strategy failure and the role of the CFO in strategy development and execution. Please join us for our next episode when we speak with Justin Pettit of Booz & Company for a two-part program on mergers and acquisitions and value-based management. Until then, this is Robert Barnwell and CFO Talk Radio wishing you all the best.
We hope that you have enjoyed this episode and found the material of value. To download a transcript of this episode, receive a free subscription to the show, or to learn more about this subject, we encourage you to visit Professor Barnwell's website at robertgbarnwell.com to explore the many executive briefings, presentations, case studies, and other resources available for immediate download. This has been a production of Robert G. Barnwell. All rights reserved.